And part of that emphasis is helping them initiate these difficult conversations when everything about them says my identity is about being liked, as opposed to shedding that and saying, I'm going to trade popularity for respect, and to recognize, hey, you know what? Let's go through this framework. Let's go through any cultural biases that, you grew up with, and you realize, you know what mom and dad taught me, it was well-meaning and it helped at the time, but it's kind of obsolete or irrelevant at this point. And so we say, hey, you don't have to hold any resentment against them. They certainly did the best they could. And so how do I forge my own identity in a world that is completely cross-cultural?
Welcome to the People-Powered Solutions podcast. In this show, you'll gain expert advice and tips on building a thriving workplace culture with happy employees. I'm your host, Lorianne Duguay, and I'm thrilled to be spending this time with you today. Welcome to another episode of People-Powered Solutions podcast. It's Friday, folks, as we're recording this episode, so that explains the more casual look I've got going on for those who are viewing it on YouTube. Today, we welcome a fellow guest, someone of like-minded nature who understands that at the end of the day, conflict is not avoidable. I've taken so many programs and courses that say, we'll teach you how to avoid conflict. Newsflash, it isn't. By its very nature, it is absolutely going to occur. So you need to instead equip your team members and your leadership teams to better navigate it. So today we welcome Jerry Fu, who will provide insight on how to navigate conflict, as well as just some leadership tips and tricks when it comes to just managing conflict within your workplace. So welcome, Jerry.
Hey, Lori, glad to be here.
Awesome. Jerry, before we get started, the way I start every one of my episodes is by allowing the guests to give a bit of history into, or glimpses, if you will, peek behind the curtain of what has brought them to do what they do today. So I will leave you to give us a bit of context into Jerry Fu. How did Jerry get to doing what Jerry does today?
Yeah. Let me do my best to keep this somewhat brief. So a Taiwanese son of immigrants, right? Like, I just wanted a place to belong. And so that a need for approval sometimes, got into unhealthy tactics, right? Where I'm just settling for popularity and trying to be the person that everybody likes because I want to be liked. And then sometimes, right, when people are upset with you for whether it's a legitimate reason or not, the default is to just take the path of least resistance. And, that started to show up, especially when I didn't know how to stand up for myself, in situations where I knew I was being wronged and I just didn't know how to handle it. And so I was in this fixed mindset where I just said, okay, well, I don't want to look incompetent. I don't want to be in situations where people don't like me. And so let me just run and avoid these situations. And it wasn't until later in life where I realized that running from a challenge does nothing to help you actually learn and grow and overcome it. And you see this overlay on my career, right? Because as a pharmacist initially in customer service, we're just taught, just diffuse a situation, make the customer happy. We can't afford to lose their business. And you go home wondering if you have a spine at all. And after enough difficult situations, I said, okay, I've had enough working at this chain pharmacy. I'm going to leverage my connections and get into a teaching position through a pharmacy consulting company, which I moved to Houston for. 11 months later, I got fired. And well, that was the first wake-up call. And I just said, okay, well, people are paying me to get a job done, not to hear stories as to why I didn't get it done. And that's another fun part with conflict aversion, where your boss is continually mad at you because she doesn't trust you. And you as a kid who didn't know any better, didn't know how to overcome that. The next wake-up call in terms of conflict was stumbling into a job where for my paychecks bounced, well, I feel for crooked doctors. And so not only am I jeopardizing my license, I'm not even getting paid for it. How do you confront a boss that's clearly ripping you off, right? They don't tell you this in life's manual. And so after enough try, struggle, failure, I actually was invited to help present some leadership workshop material through a pharmacy leadership nonprofit some of my friends run. And so teaching leadership kind of helped open my mind to possibilities about what kind of leader I could become. Because before I just said, I'm never going to be good at this, like conflict and leadership, I'm never going to be good at these things. And then now I ask myself, well, what if I could be good at these things? And that's when the work started to happen. And then after enough job opportunities that opened up because of my leadership experience, once I took on some managerial positions, but ultimately did not have viable business models, I said, I think I want to make people development a full-time calling. And that also took a lot of trial, struggle, and failure. But
For
so far,
sure.
I will be celebrating 3 years since starting my LLC next month, actually, as I still have my day job as a pharmacist. And so, yeah, my day job as a pharmacist serves as, in a way, my leadership lab to test out my conflict resolution skills every single day.
That's amazing. So you're still working as a pharmacist as well.
Correct. I'm
That's
doing the
amazing.
grind. Yeah.
Oh
Yep.
my God. That's a very similar path. I started out, well, I've been working for government, for those listening in, they're aware at this point. They've listened to a few episodes
Yeah.
for 21 years. And I
Mm,
started consulting on the side, similar to you. But eventually it became just so busy that I decided to take that leap of faith and never looked back. But very interesting that we have similar pathways. You said a few things. Started out as a pharmacist, and when you mentioned it kind of threw a bell in my brain of how we're trained and conditioned at such a young age. I remember my first job, I think it was at KFC. I was told the customer is always right, and I would tell you that every other job after that was 100% exactly the approach that you said: diffuse, 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 listen, the customer is always right. That was pretty much the only way to go. But in terms of serving me as a person and helping me develop the skills required
mm,
to navigate those more courageous conversations, that did about nothing, right? That just taught
yeah.
me that avoidance approach. And thank you for, you're giving me an aha moment this morning.
Sure.
Realizing the importance of, be it a teenager starting their first job, if you're an employer listener, and if you own a company or you're a leader who leads anyone, do not tell them to always just accept and listen to the customer and just assume they're always right, without teaching them how to respectfully have that more courageous conversation. So early on in the episode, I've got a bit of an aha moment and thought we'd just highlight that to everyone. So interesting pathway, pharmacist, and then you segue into teaching is what is
Yes,
that?
yeah. So I had a teaching job briefly, yeah, through a consulting company. Yes, and then went back into retail because I lost that job. Yep.
Okay, so that's the one I want to talk about, though, because you
Yeah.
kind of snuck it in, but I want to
Yeah.
more about that.
Absolutely.
Tell us about what saved your career after you got fired. Like, what were some of the aha moments that experience brought about?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it
Okay.
was awful tasting medicine at the time, but I can look back now. It took some reframing to realize that was, in a way, the best thing that could have ever happened to me, because it made me realize that this successful, like, victimhood, right? Like, this chain pharmacy could get mad at me, and I thought, well, they can get mad at me if I mess up every once in a while, but I know they would never fire me, right? And I had a lot of leeway with that, but in a smaller company that was very much about holding people accountable to the jobs that they hired you to do, right? It led me to realize, hey, the last thing the boss needs to hear from you is, sorry, boss, I couldn't get it done, right?
Yeah.
The thing that you can do, it doesn't matter. Like, as long as you don't do anything illegal or immoral, right, in the process of or unethical trying to get your job done, think outside the box, right? You're just like, hey, I have to find a way to get this done. So if my boss says, hey, Jerry, is this done? I can just say, yep. And that's it. Yeah.
I like that. And I think often in those kind of world shattering experiences, like being fired, being let go, there are glimpses of learning and growth that are there. And it's important to take the time to reflect and to recognize on, obviously, if I ended up here today, I need to make some different choices if I don't want to end up here again. So thank you for that incredible journey. Love that you're still doing the LLC as a side gig, all the while continuing to bring impact in the world of a pharmacy. I also like that you use puns like a taste of my own bad medicine. Is that a pharmacist pun?
You know what? It is, whether I like it or not.
That was really, I was like, oh, that would be appropriate for a pharmacist to use saying like that.
True.
Okay, so let's jump right into it. Conflict. Let's talk about, what are maybe, okay, number one, let's help people understand how unavoidable conflict is, if you're okay with that, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, no. So let's go over some examples of, there's healthy conflict and unhealthy conflict, right?
Let's do it.
Yeah, there's healthy conflict, right? When a business realizes that its business model is no longer viable and they have to have a difficult discussion as to whether or not they can pivot to something else, right? Mm-hmm. Intel, for those of you who don't know, Intel actually used to be in the memory chip business. And when they realized that microprocessors they were onto something there, IBM had made a big offer, to say, hey, like you have an opportunity here. It's a big client with lots of money. And the CEO at the time had some real difficulty with pushback within the company, even though their memory chip market share was being lost to cheaper and faster competitors. There were people that said, no, this is our identity. Like, we can't just let this go. And, he understood the company could only commit to one path. And he asked himself, well, if they fired me and brought in a replacement, what would he do? And he said, well, my replacement would not be emotionally attached to old and dying things. So we're going to go with microprocessors. And he said, why don't I just don't do that myself? And so he did and saved his job. And the rest is history, right? Yeah, unlike, right? So let's look at an example that wasn't so happy. Continental Airlines, right? For those of you who remember, before they got swallowed up by United, Continental tried to emulate Southwest's discount strategy by trying to do something called Continental Light. But because they straddled two fences, they had too many problems trying to get like their side hustle in a way, like off the ground, literally, because they're planes. And, the company folded.
Master of puns today.
Oh, yeah. I it's been rubbing off from some dad friends of mine, and it's terrible. Like, I didn't even realize. And so, yeah, but right, they didn't pivot properly. They didn't commit to one strategy full on, and it ultimately cost them the business, right? Mm-hmm. So,
absolutely.
So that context,
that unhealthy conflict versus healthy. Now let's bring it even down to the employee level.
Yeah, like absolutely. Yeah,
right. Let's talk about. Let's give examples of the unhealthy versus the healthy.
Okay.
I think it has to do a lot with how we react, our reaction to conflict.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And when we work with organizations, we try and teach them to reframe the way that they see conflict, because the way that you perceive conflict will directly correlate with your reaction to it and your tendency to actually address it or not, or avoid it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So let's dive in. So if conflict, the story I told myself as a recovering people pleaser, right, was conflict, it means I did something wrong. Right. Conflict means I did something wrong and I have to apologize or do something in order to make it go away, as opposed to a more of a growth mindset which we like to nerd out on, which is conflict is an opportunity to get to know someone better and an opportunity to learn and improve. Right.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. That's 100% where we like to go. One of the first things I do in a conflict management workshop is I ask people to write down or to say out loud the first word that comes to mind when we say the word conflict. I would say about 98.9% are negative connotations that are the same as your first part, right? Like, oh my God, I've done something wrong. It's uncomfortable. People are upset. There's tension. There's frustration. And then I then ask them to write a definition of conflict, and they're not allowed to use any negative words, any words that have a negative connotation.
Nice. Yeah.
Suddenly, they're starting to see conflict through an entirely different lens. And they start to see it for the beauty it brings. And then I use examples of, when you go to the gym, how the next day you're convinced someone's lowered every seat in your household. You count the stairs and you're like, how have I not noticed how many stairs are there? But how from that discomfort, the following day, you suddenly feel so much stronger and you're like, oh my God, I forgot I had muscles there, right? And just it's the same thing with conflict. The more that as an organization, you encourage people to address it and to engage in it, you facilitate engaging in that more productive type conflict, the less you're going to start to see some of the more destructive behaviors that are, linked to a number of other challenges with your people management. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was going to say any other insights relevant to just kind of drawing these nuances of the different kinds of conflict.
Yeah, I think one observation or one idea that came up for some participants actually when we did a conflict creation workshop was to provide like a safe word, right? To say like ouch or something like that. And then that's just kind of like a gentle but intentional way of saying, hey, there's something here we need to to address, right? And so when people realize, hey, I can say this and, raise my hand, or Brene Brown likes to use the word "let's rumble," right? Because when they know that like this difficult conversation is coming up, it's like, okay, we're gonna have to spar to get this, sorted out, and you fight clean, right? And no heads below the belt, but ultimately people come out stronger, because the blessing, right, with conflict, healthy or unhealthy, is that people are being honest with each other. People don't lie about why they're upset with you. And so the sooner that you get this honesty out in the open, where you can kind of dissect it and study it together, the more likely you are to actually collaborate to find a solution on something, because you realize you finally agreed on the problem, and it's not the person, it's the situation. Right?
Absolutely. That's a key one, right? Don't attack the person, attack the situation. Often we'll talk about when you're navigating as a leader, as a manager, you're helping two team members navigate conflict, and you're doing a bit of a mediation and informal mediation. I tell them to never sit the two parties face to face, because that in and of itself, as an environment, puts them in this very kind of oppositional mode, instead of sitting them side by side, having a flip chart ahead of them and highlighting what the problem is, just to kind of transmit that we're here to attack the problem, not each other, right? You said about the safe word, or that word to say, like, ouch. Love that. I was working with a healthcare organization, and we were doing these shared commitments. They'd had like rampant conflict for a while now, and we decided just to regroup and as a team say, okay, what are some of the behaviors that we're seeing that we don't want to accept anymore, that we know are wrong, and then what are some of the shared commitments we want to make to ensure they don't reproduce themselves, and what would a more productive behavior look like. Good. And so they were saying, yeah, it's fun, but how do I call the other person out when they're adopting that negative behavior? And I'm a huge everything disc fan. And there are certain styles of personalities that is just against how they're wired to say, ouch. So they came up with a sign. And so they were like, the timeout sign meant, I don't need to explain it, but I'm feeling like you are crossing a certain line right now. And this is me saying, we're going to pause right now. We'll both kind of go back to reflect and regroup later on to discuss it. Good. And so I followed up with them, and I'm like, how's the sign going? They said, it's crazy. Even the most introverted person who would have never said anything suddenly felt empowered, because she didn't have to verbalize. That's kind of that next level for that individual, for example. But she could just go like this. And the rule was, the shared commitment was, if someone does this, whether it was intended or not, is irrelevant. That's how it was received. And you need to respectfully walk away, reflect, and then we regroup to discuss. Good. So I thought that was really, it was funny that you had that safe word. So it's similar practitioners' approaches to just making sure that people are comfortable, and that much more apt, because the more we make them comfortable with conflict, the more they're going to be okay. Nobody's ever going to say, I love conflict. Well, unless you're a lawyer, because it's just by your very nature, it's what you need to do, is to engage in debate to some extent. But certainly if you're able to support your team into having the tools and the skills and the training they need to have the conversations respectfully, then I think that can be game-changing for a team. Okay. I've done way too much talking already in this episode, so I'm going to throw it back to you. Now we know that conflict is, there's different kinds, and which kind we need to encourage more of. We didn't necessarily touch on how inevitable it is. If we think about the causes of conflict, right? Causes of conflict, what are we going to do here? Different ways of working, different priorities. Yeah. If Jerry's a task-focused person, I'm a people-focused person. Obviously, there's a likelihood for some conflict to happen, some tension to arise. There is so many different causes that once you start to deep dive, just a quick Google will give you some causes. You're going to realize that sometimes we even feel conflicted within ourselves. My brain is saying one thing, my heart's saying something else. If that's the case, do we really think that conflict's avoidable? No. So now that we know it's not avoidable, Jerry, I'm going to ask for you to share this framework that you gave me a kind of a glimpse of before we started recording, to help our listeners better navigate and feel equipped to navigate conflict.
Absolutely. Yeah. So if you haven't picked up on the pattern already, human emotions are part of being human, and at the same time, when they get the best of us in difficult moments, right, whether it's the lizard brain where they say, fight, flight, or freeze, the best thing to do is to have a procedure in place, right, some kind of standard operating procedure to say, okay, there's a conflict and things are starting to escalate. Okay, get the fire extinguisher, right, here we go. The 5-step process that I give away for free on my website goes like this. The first step is to imagine, for the person having to initiate a conversation, imagine what a successful conversation would sound like, right? Is it a roommate? You just need to say, hey, can you stop leaving dirty dishes in the sink, right? We don't have to say it's realistic. We just need to think that it's possible. And just to say, because if you set a low ceiling on the conversation, guess what? It won't get any better than what you imagine it to be. So we need to kind of help open our mind to the idea that, maybe they might actually be receptive to this. And so we're not dying 1,000 deaths before we even step into the ring, right? The second step is 10 seconds of courage. And a lot of people love this one because I tell people, you don't have to be a superhero, just be one for 10 seconds, right? 10 seconds, stretch yourself. Can you send that email, send that text, pick up that phone, set the boulder in motion, lock the gate behind you, because otherwise what happens? You're going to rationalize, maybe I just need to sleep on it another day, right? Maybe you do until
I need to stop you on that one. Like, that's awesome. I love everything about that one.
Yeah.
Because for our listeners, some are very introverted to my earlier point, and 10 seconds of courage seems doable. When you, again, back to my exercise, right? If I've got to maintain push-ups for 5 minutes straight, I am not even starting. But if you tell me you need to maintain them for 30 seconds, I can do that, right?
Yeah.
So not even 30, you're saying 10 seconds of courage to initiate, get that boulder in motion and lock the gate behind you. So you don't give yourself the option to turn back.
Yep. Yeah. And some people say 10 seconds still seems long. I'm like, can you do 5? Like, oh, it's like, hey, just get it started. And you don't have to.
And as a leader, I think people should adopt that, guys. Everyone listening, why not have that conversation with that employee? We've all had the employee come into our office to say, I need to have this conversation, but I just can't do it. So can you do it for me? Can you sit there for me? Can you address this for me? No, you need to help empower them to have that conversation. So to Jerry's point, say, can you handle 5 seconds? Let's practice it. What might that look like? Once they've got a bit of the narrative in their mind, or they've got the script per se, they're more likely to engage and actually deliver and get that boulder in motion. Okay.
Yeah.
So I love that.
Awesome.
You're on step 2. I'm sorry.
It's okay. No, we're gonna get through it.
Like
it. Absolutely. Step 3 then is to script your critical phrases, right? People too often think, oh, I'm just going to remember everything in the moment, and you're not. So get everything out on paper, right? Get your thoughts organized, prioritized, and say, okay, here are the 2 or 3 main points that I know I need to bring up in this conversation, whether it's you ask your boss for a raise, right? That's always a fun source of conflict, or punctuality is another fun one. And so you say, okay, if these are the 3 main points that I'm going to make for my case, how will they push back? Or, how will they counter my argument? And how will I counter the counter, right? So this is the idea of a bookending where we say, okay, first, in the first step, we've said, okay, what's success look like? And then what are some failures that we need to anticipate, right? There's a concept called the pre-mortem that says, how could this go wrong? And how can I counter those and be ready for those, right? Oh, there's obstacles are inevitable. Okay. Which are the most likely ones, and how do we want to, prepare for them? Then step 4 is to rehearse these moves. You didn't just do homework, right? This isn't a test. You just get all the right answers and submit and get a good grade. You have to actually get in front of a mirror and look at your body language, hear your tone of voice. How am I calm? Am I collected? Can I iron out my phrasing so I don't trip over my words in the moment? Maybe I role play with a friend. Hey, can you pretend to be my boss that I'm trying to get this, raise from? And then step 5 is to follow through, right? Because we've discussed that conflict is not an innate skill exclusive to a select few. It is a skill that can be learned and improved over time. And so if you're willing to fail, then you have an opportunity to evaluate and adjust and try again. No one says failure is final unless you insist on that. So those are the 5 steps that I use all the time, right? And then share with other people. Yeah.
I love it. And it's really, there are 5 steps that will not make you likely to have that conversation. There are 5 steps that will make you have that conversation, right? Yeah. based on what you've just shared, there's really no room. That gate is locked. There's no room to renege once you get that boulder in motion. But one of the things I want to highlight a couple of things before you get that boulder in motion, before you lock that gate. The importance of realizing what it is I'm hoping to get from this conversation, right? Sometimes in reflecting and starting to see, what the motivation behind having the conversation is, what would that end result look like? What am I hoping? What do I need to get from this? You realize that inevitably you're never going to get that from that individual, or you're never going to get that. It's more about you. It's not necessarily about them. They don't have control over your emotions. They don't have control over some of the issues that maybe you're projecting into this situation that are from a past belief or a past, negative pattern. So just to take the time to reflect, what is it I want from this conversation, and to validate that this conversation absolutely needs to happen. But again, not to get lost in this overthinking where you're just trying to justify not having the conversation, just to look at the motives behind the conversation and understand the end game is basically what I'm getting at there. Mm-hmm. And then once you have engaged in that conversation, before you start to have it, especially if it's a more sensitive topic, to be very clear on expectations and very clear on shared commitments on how we're going to navigate this conversation. And start with, this is not personal. I want to be clear. This is strictly work related, for example, and use that SBI approach that here's the situation. This is the behavior I've noticed, and here's the impact on your work or the impact on the team. And then take that as your starting point to build from there, to have, an action plan put together to mitigate the issue, or to fix, or to heal that relationship, right? It's that actual conversation itself sometimes can be quite intimidating, and people fail to recognize the importance of nonverbal cues, as well as the impact of tone and emphasis, and what those kind of elements, how they can skew the interpretation of your message. So to make sure to confirm that your message is being interpreted as close to what you intended it to be as possible. So key phrases I ask is like, hey, this is what I'm seeing. Help me understand your perspective. Or, this is what I've heard. Is that correct? Is that accurate? Based on what you were just saying, it sounds like. And then this is just key phrases for them to confirm whether or not your message has landed as you intended it. Because in those missed landings is where the breakdown of relationships can occur. There's that potential for breakdown. So to make sure that you're staying on top of them, and that, hey, this isn't what I meant. Because often you'll hear mediation, that's what it is about, right? We're there as a mediator to act as the conduit between the two parties, because they'll say things like, and we'll use like a family related mediation as an example, he's supposed to drop the kids off for separation at 7 p.m. on Sunday nights. He never shows up until 8 o'clock. By the time he shows up, it's bath time, and it's bath time, and I got to put them to bed. So it's just so frustrating that he can't respect a schedule. I'm like, okay, so from what we're hearing is that his inability to respect that schedule is impacting your quality time with your children. Yeah, that's what I said. Not really what you said, but that's the whole role, right? Like it's emotions. You talked about emotions and how they impact, and they will dictate your reactions. So to be aware of them, and then to make sure that you're confirming that, yes, that's what I meant, or no, not at all, and providing that space for people to clarify what the actual intent was. Awesome. Okay, so I love that 5-step framework. How about you give us a bit of insight, Jerry, into the type of work you do with clients, and how you work with clients to help them better navigate conflict and embrace the power of innovation and of diversity that conflict can bring to an organization?
Yeah. My target audience is Asian leaders and directors and supervisors less than a year into their role. And the latest elevator pitch is that I help these Asian leaders become more visible, vocal, and valuable so that they can go from self-doubt to self-assurance. And part of that emphasis is helping them initiate these difficult conversations when everything about them says my identity is about being liked, as opposed to shedding that and saying, I'm going to trade popularity for respect, and to recognize, hey, you know what? Yeah, let's go through this framework. Let's go through any cultural biases that, you grew up with, and you realize, you know what mom and dad taught me, it was well-meaning and it helped at the time, but it's kind of obsolete or irrelevant at this point. And so we say, hey, you don't have to hold any resentment against them. They certainly did the best they could. And so how do I forge my own identity in a world that is completely cross-cultural, right? So whether it's around coaching or journaling or questions or sharing fun literature, it's all part of the coaching experience that I bring to the table.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
So are there any specific tips that you find yourself kind of regularly providing to your clients in terms of how to find that voice and how to move away from that unconfident person towards a more affirmative person?
Yeah, part of it is recognizing, first is just to be comfortable with discomfort and recognizing, hey, just because it's unpleasant doesn't mean it's bad. And that's another story we tell ourselves, right? Like, conflict is bad. It's like, oh, pain is bad and discomfort is bad. It's like, well, is it really? Or is that the story you want to keep telling yourself? Right.
Yeah. Is that your excuse to avoid?
Exactly. Yeah. So that's one. And to help them, right, we ask them, if courage is lacking, like if you said, I've tried 10 seconds, Jerry, I can't get there. And I say, well, can you use curiosity instead? Right? Because now you're just leaning into it because you say, wow, this is really intense. Let me learn more about it. Right? Instead of saying, oh, it's intense, I need to create distance because I'm afraid I'll get burned. Right? And another one is we shift from confrontation to collaboration, where you realize, hey, you know what? We can go from opposite side of the table to the same side of the table because we finally agreed on what the real problem is. So I can't do this without you. How do we work toward a resolution? Right.
Oh, yeah.
And then finally we say something like humility, right? Approach with humility along with curiosity. And we say, what am I missing? Right. I only have two eyes. I can only have, one or two perspectives. You tell me, what am I missing? And usually when people say, hey, this is one of those classic cases of I can't do my job well unless you do yours well. And, the same boss signs our paychecks. So, if we're on the same side, how do we want to work together well? And
in workplace mediation, it's usually when we start with, to your point, defining what the actual problem is, right? Okay, so let's talk about the issues that have brought us here today between two employees, right? And then they each get their turn, and there's a rule that, or shared commitment. You speak through me, not to each other. You stay side by side, and I stay by that board, and I'm just writing it. There's no right or wrong issue, because if it was an issue for you, then it needs to be noted, right? So we note all that down, and what are some of the issues that brought us here today, and now let's define what the actual issues are, which are the ones that we definitively, a lot of these might have been symptoms, but this was the actual root issue. And then to your point of that vision, if it went well, it's, what would the ideal state look like? What would we leave here today in an ideal world? And we would have, and it's usually always, I could go to work and not be stressed about having to deal with you on a daily basis, vice versa. And what they ultimately both want is just to be able to work without having this looming stress and tension, and having to walk on eggshells, if you will, around each other. That's usually their shared, that's what end game. That's the end goal. And so it's easy for us to then say, okay, what needs to happen? Well, first we give them the opportunity, of course, to address the issues and help each other understand each other's perspective. Okay, now it's your turn. Jerry, Lori said that when this happened, this is how it went down. Can you help her understand your perspective in reference to that? Often it's like, oh my God, I absolutely didn't mean it that way. This is not at all what it meant. This is what it actually meant, and this is why it occurred the way it did. And then you start to see all the little aha moments, and they start to see, oh my God, they went right to that mind chatter of, this person is trying to belittle me, this person is trying to take advantage of me, because they have all this other baggage from their youth that they've carried into the workplace. But suddenly when they assume positive intent, they're able to see that that's not at all what they were intending. And that's not how it landed. So already by the time we're to the point of that ideal state, they've worked through a lot of the issues and they've started to think about what they need to do differently moving forward in order to avoid these issues arising again. So by the time they've defined the problem, then we move into that beautiful spot of solutionizing and saying, okay, what are some of our shared commitments? What are some of the things that need to happen for us to ensure that we're able to achieve this ideal state and that we're able to avoid what has happened and transpired in the past? And that's where you start to see that synergy between the two parties who came in so oppositional, and suddenly they're working in tandem to solutionize that problem. And as leaders, listeners, if you're able to master that process, it can be game changing. And if you're able to support your team members in owning that process, and before jumping to conclusion and before jumping into defense mode and adopting some very destructive conflict behaviors, to pause and go through that same cycle of, okay, what is going on here? What are some of the issues at play? Let's come to an understanding. Help me understand your perspective, and vice versa. Okay, what needs to happen for this to never happen again? And have those more courageous conversations. It can be absolutely game changing when it comes to team building, when it comes to collaboration, when it comes to it at the end of the day is one of the pillars of those 5 behaviors of a high performing team is teams who are able to engage in productive conflict. Because in that productive conflict lies innovation, lies effective communication, lies solutionizing and strategic thinking. So it's important for you to encourage and facilitate healthy debate, facilitate healthy conflict within your workplace. Folks, that's pretty much all the time we've got this week. Jerry, thank you so much for this insightful conversation. If you had one nugget of wisdom or one tip or strategy you want to leave with our audience, what would that be?
Man,
I know, high pressure tactic there, eh?
Oh, absolutely. Well, the one that comes to mind is listen and not respond. Seek first to understand, then to be understood, right? The classic Stephen Covey. And because what happens when you interrupt? It means you jumped on the first thing, you felt the need to rush and defend yourself, and now the other person feels disrespected because they knew you weren't really listening. You were just trying to jump on the first thing. And if you want to interrupt, it's your choice, and just understand it rarely helps the situation. I'll say
absolutely. I would say it seldom helps at all.
Yeah.
So thank you for joining us. If listeners want to continue connecting with you, Jerry, how can they do that?
Yeah, the guide we mentioned, I give away for free at www.adaptingleaders.com/guide. There's also a free blog and other fun resources if you check out the website. But if you want to download the guide for yourself, it's, again, all you do is provide your email address and we'll send it right to you. adaptingleaders.com/guide.
Awesome. And if they want to connect with you and maybe they're part of your target audience and they want to get some coaching and have a conversation, they reach out through LinkedIn, through your website.
Yeah, the website also has an opportunity where you can schedule a complimentary 30-minute call, whether you want to share your story or just say, hey, I want to get a free sample of coaching, by all means do so. And yeah, connect with me on LinkedIn if you want. I'm still going to send you the same link. So one way or the other, we'll get you on the phone. So there you go.
And we will, for our listeners' benefit, we will be sharing all of those links in our show notes. So make sure to check them out and to connect with Jerry. And thank you, everyone, for listening. As I do with every episode, I ask that you take all this beautiful information, this 5-step framework, these 10 seconds of courage, this conflict aversion concept. Take all of what you've heard and think about which one action I could implement relevant to what I've just heard. Now get out there and do that. Well, folks, thanks for joining us for yet another enriching conversation. To hear more about today's guests, make sure to check out the links in the description of this episode. Want to continue the conversation? Then head on over to our social media platforms, all of which are also linked in the description, to keep it going. Finally, don't forget to subscribe to make sure you don't miss another valuable episode.